Padmasambhava in the way that different cultural groups, communities identify themselves. We're really thinking about relationships there as well. How does he fit into these different networks? And each of the presentations there talked about ways that individuals and communities define themselves in relationship to Padmasambhava. And again, in the treasure tradition, we thought a lot about Padmasambhava's relationship to certain female figures, to Yeshe Tsogyal. And then in other communities, the relationships between Tertuns and consorts, the role of women there. And so those relationships are so central to the understanding of Padmasambhava. And of course, this morning, we saw very clearly these social ritual communities where Padmasambhava's absence or presence is negotiated through ritual practices in all those different ways. So in this concluding discussion, I hope that we'll start to look at some of the relationships between these different perspectives, right? Not just in each of those different groupings, but if we look more broadly, what can we come to understand about Padmasambhava as a figure really at the heart of Tibetan religiosity in many ways? And how do we bring those things together? What questions arise from considering those different perspectives together? One of our presenters, Janet Gyatso, unfortunately had to return to her responsibilities at Harvard last night, but she kindly sent some thoughts by email. So Elena is going to share those.
You can read it.
Or I will, I guess. I haven't seen these yet, so we'll see what these say. But
imagine this is Janet.
Right. Yeah. These were Janet's thoughts. A good hot shower and a hot cup. Should I read that part? And a hot cup of coffee cleared my head and made me realize what I might have said better yesterday, but also an idea for going forward. In my opinion, the high bar, the gold standard for Tibetan studies is always: will academics working in other fields beyond Tibetan studies find our work of any interest? And I feel that we should reach to make the answer to that question yes, as much as we can. Not always possible, of course, but as much as possible is good. Why should anyone other than a group of people obsessed with Tibetan culture and history care about Padmasambhava? I was reaching, albeit clunkily and vaguely, in that direction yesterday in my remarks about the human in the Padmasambhava material, i.e. a big question for so many of us in the humanities is: how do we conceive of the human? What is the history of such an idea and its various valences? How and under what circumstances do things become more human, as opposed to idealized, not credible, too difficult, too dismissive of imperfection dogma? Another issue that we talked about in the panel I was on was sexuality and feminist perspectives thereon. So a question moving forward would be: what do we learn about the history of sexuality and human flourishing from the Padmasambhava lore? What are the problems in the Padmasambhava lore? We already discussed this somewhat, but what might be the lessons? What can we imagine better for the world regarding sexuality and human flourishing and inspiration and wisdom as a result of studying and thinking about Padmasambhava? So those are some questions from Janet.
Any responses?
Well, I think it made me think of one, because we couldn't invite everyone that we wanted to, and so a couple of people that we had thought to invite might have comments on that or have contributed to some of those. Sarah Jacobi and Antonio Torrone, right? They've written about this lay, Nakba, or non-monastic community. But we have one example, and it's funny that it hasn't come up at all in the course of this seminar. That we do have Sarah Khandro's biographies and her own record of her experience with this tantric sexuality and so forth. And I think if Sarah were here, it could be an interesting contribution. But if there are people who don't know her work, I think we probably down to the people who do know her work. But it is a really, I think, an interesting example of, again, it's one woman. We don't necessarily take it as representative, but it is an example of an actual Tibetan woman who's writing about these experiences.
Yeah. Wait for the microphone.
Yeah. Just a comment. Actually, Nicolas Schneider and I, we edited a small volume in Revue Tibetaine about female practitioners and healers and visionaries of all kinds across tantric and other sort of daily realms. And it might have been a bit revolutionary in itself to do that, because it was really trying to stretch boundaries between Buddhism, Burn, or where we usually draw boundaries or tend to see some. And also look at lay women and, you know, new traditions that are evolving around this whole question of female agency in, kind of whatever salvational well-being and so on realms. And that might be actually a nice possibility, what Janet is talking about in terms of, you know, how do we get beyond this kind of tantric cycle we're kind of stuck in. Through our subjects in a way, but then also through our focus, because of course we focus on that, and then there's so much around it, and so maybe there are ways to actually address that, but I'm not sure how it is for historical texts, how much context you can know or generate through comparative work in order to grasp these more maybe social aspects, or it always seems to be so centered on figures, personalities, and personal experiences that it kind of seems to be difficult for me anyway as an anthropologist to grasp a larger picture of what's behind it.
Right there.
Do you wanna-
Oh,
Shall I
sorry,
start?
one minute over there. Here we have.
Unless you wanted to answer or to follow immediately.
I was going to follow up on that a little, and also to
Yep.
Janet's.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's been so rich and generative and interesting. Sort of to address what you were bringing up about maybe how do we understand texts in this kind of way, and how do I think one thing for me that has been kind of really absent here has been a sort of a queer understanding of things, and sort of naming the really problematically heterosexual, heteronormative context in which all of these things are operating, and that has not been questioned or problematized at all by scholarship, and also by the subjects in a large degree. I think that if we bring a queer hermeneutic to texts, it can sort of surface really ambiguous places and liminal places that might be completely missed if that kind of eye isn't brought to bear on sort of aspects in a text that might be slippery or elude a gaze that's coming from a different kind of theoretical framework. I think that speaking of relationships, sort of thematizing relationships are deeply, deeply, profoundly gendered. Not only interpersonal relationships, but intrapersonal, like the way that a person relates to their understanding of what their gender is or how they're relating in the world. And Janet was sort of surfacing the idea yesterday of feminist historiography, and I find myself wondering about queer historiography and what we might recover, the voices that have been lost, and also the emerging voices. Tenzin Mariko is in Dharamsala. She's the first out Tibetan woman in history. I had the chance to meet her last summer, and she's incredible, and has been blessed by Sakya Trinzen and His Holiness the Karmapa, well, the one that's like in Dharamsala. And so these things are important, and they've been missed, and they've been elided, not just by scholarship, but also by the tradition, and I think that they're really important, and they can open up really new and exciting ways of understanding the material and understanding the Dharma, for whatever that's worth.
If I could answer a little, or just respond to that a little bit. I had a student who was really interested in looking at homosexual relations in monasteries, and Melvin Goldstein had done some research into it based on oral history, and so there is a sexuality that goes on in the monasteries, aside from the ones who go out and have relationships that they shouldn't be having. They're sort of, but he really he struggled to find material, right? You can't find it in the text, and no one wants to talk about it, right? So it's not for not looking, but there are other ways, obviously, that we could look or read against the sources and so forth, obviously.
Yeah, I would also say along those lines that it's not just a matter of trying to sift through history to find examples of queer Tibetans in history, but also that there are materials in these traditions that point to a sort of gender fluidity, just in terms of the ways that all aspects of our identity are fluid in these contexts. And so that doesn't necessarily carry over into social interactions or structures in different Tibetan societies, but certainly there's a central position of visualizing oneself as of another gender. And when I talk about relationship to Padmasambhava, one of the most common ways is through Guru Yoga practice, visualizing oneself in a female body and the very gendered, heterosexual relationship, but there's an erotic element to Guru Yoga in the depiction and imagination of oneself as someone desiring the Guru, and male-bodied people and female-bodied people both are instructed to practice that in a visualized female body. So I think there are a lot of connections between some of the ideas that are raised by perspectives from kind of a queer approach to these texts, that we can find really interesting meeting points, even if we can't find someone who identifies in any kind of terminology or category that would match that category in some way. But I think those are other areas that could be interesting. Sorry, Nicola.
Yeah, I think that Janet's question is obviously an excellent question to keep in mind. How does what we do possibly speak to scholars outside of our small group? And then you can. One question is how far you'd like to open up, for instance, and already opening up, for instance, to scholars who are specialists of the Buddhist world, but working in other parts of the Buddhist world. That's already one way of really opening up quite a bit. And here, it's easy to realize that there is a lot of what we've been pointing to, themes that we've been addressing, that is specific for this particular part of the Buddhist world, and that could bring something very interesting to larger discussions in that sense. For instance, so we've been mentioning, of course, gender dimensions, gender dynamics, and of course the fact that we are here in a very tantric culture, much more than at any other part of Buddhist Asia. This has the correlate that we are observing things that cannot be observed elsewhere, and there are discussions that can be, there's fuel for discussions that really we can bring preeminently. Gender has been mentioned a lot, but David, in his opening comments, very clearly assumed there would be people in the room who might not be specialists yet, pointed to some of the very distinctive features of Tibetan Buddhism, and the fact, for instance, that we have processes of revelation like the Terma tradition. Now here is again something that we have that is really, from the perspective of the Buddhist world, something actually quite special and really interesting to discuss. And so for scholars who are interested in processes of revelation, the textual dimension, the question of social relations, authority, etc. I mean, there's a lot to be woven, I think, out of that theme, for instance. Yet another theme that was addressed perhaps a bit more today, we talked about this dual clergy that you have in Tibetan Buddhism, right from the beginnings, as far as we can tell, of Tibetan Buddhism. We've had this double clergy. Of course, sources are posterior to the fact, but tell us of Tibetan kings having a monk sit on their hair on one side and a tantrist on the other side. I mean, those are figures that have been part of Tibetan Buddhism from the beginning. There's this understanding throughout Tibetan areas that we have this dual clergy, whereas the paradigm, the central paradigm throughout Buddhist Asia is, of course, the figure of the monk. And here things are more complex. Here we don't have simply the monk, which we can paraphrase as the renouncer in Dumontian terms, although how much of a renouncer it is, I mean, there's a discussion that is to be had there. So it's not just the monk renouncer versus the lay. Here we have a third category, which is in a way between the two, and which makes these social dynamics within Buddhist religion really interesting to examine. And the final question suggested by Jamyang, what about lay practice, for instance? And here, this points to yet one element of specificity which needs to be interrogated and which can be part of, therefore, us joining larger discussions. Why is it, or how can we understand Buddhist modernity in Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly in Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet, because if there are clearly differences between what is happening in exile and what we find in Tibet. And here we have, for instance, Nyingmapa communities like Larungar, Yachingar that are innovating. So I mean, there is a lot, I think, that we can bring to larger discussions on a number of core aspects of what this complex religious system is.
Yes, just to kind of follow on from what Nicholas is saying and what actually Joshua was saying. That's a very good question, Joshua, and good comment. That kind of fluidity, that kind of fluid, porous boundaries, I think that is one thing that can be applied, not only this kind of gendered language that we're using, but sometimes in biographies, as you two pointed out, which is true, that sometimes when you're in biographies and in Tibetan ritual texts and in Tibetan literature, actually sometimes there's no gender. You can't tell if an agent or if a subject was a man or a woman or neutral, manang. Yeah? So this needs to be, sometimes when translation takes place, sometimes people put he or she when it wasn't even there. That needs to be noticed. And also Tibetan language itself is a neutral language. It's a non-gendered language. So it has got, also, for instance, it's got, of course, po, mo, but manang or son sanmil, it hasn't got gender, no gender, or two-gendered, or that kind of linguistically, there's a fluidity there. I think it's quite interesting to look at that. And then I think maybe we should kind of apply this fluid kind of boundary to other things, for instance, fluidity between history and religion, religious practice, and this kind of social interactions taking place, where kind of history and religious narrative blur and couldn't really be separated from each other, or sometimes could be separated. But also these are questions I think we need to ask seriously. And in terms of practitioners, we talked about Nyingma practitioners a lot. We talked about Nyingma school a lot. But as far as I know, most Tibetans follow Guru Rinpoche.
Yes.
They say day and night, they say Guru Rinpoche prayers. And what are these? Why are they not being mentioned? Why is it dictated by kind of, one attention to sort of one school of Tibetan Buddhism or something? Then again, where kind of, I think, the boundaries being sharpened when it wasn't even there or something. I think these are sort of kind of interesting things and things that we need to address and tackle when we're looking at Guru Rinpoche, or when we're looking at anything on Tibet or anything maybe on human. And after all, I think in terms of human, I'm not exactly sure what is human by what Janet means. But if we talk about history, religion, everything is a human production. So at the end of the day, it comes out of humanity. So I guess, you can't separate it from us anyway.
Yes, please.
And just going off what Joshua and Lamaja just offered, I want to give a very, very generous hermeneutic reading of queer theory and connect that with what I think we could possibly be borrowing from other disciplines as well. Is I keep thinking about myth and myth-making this past 2 days, how Padmasambhava is this mythical hero in Tibetan religions and in Tibetan culture and in Tibetan history. And Wendy Doniger, I think in her study, that was a long time ago, in the 80s, of the Shiva myth in Hinduism, I do not remember the exact quote, but I remember what she says is myth is trying to reconcile what is ultimately irreconcilable. It is trying to make sense of something that cannot be made sense of. So, and we keep pushing in this past 2 days, we keep pushing boundaries and keep problematizing things that are seeming to be dichotomies that would not be reconciled. We have India versus Tibet. We have lay versus monastic. We have men versus women. We have what else? We have the old and the new canons. We have the old and the new schools. We have the human versus divine. So for me, I think if we're taking the mystical studies or queer studies perspective, maybe it is good, and what we can offer for other disciplines is to keep problematizing the dichotomies and keep pushing boundaries and keep, like all good myths do, to keep reconciling what is irreconcilable in some regards.
Can I just also add something before I forget? Sorry, and I don't mean to bring everything again back to gender, because I think we also need to remember that there is a difference between gender and sexuality, and what we were actually talking about yesterday was mostly about sexuality. So we don't really need to kind of, limit the discussion. And speaking of sexuality, I think that's partly what Janet was referring to by the use of human, because any gender is still human. And it also allows us to think in much more broader universal terms rather than be limited to a particular, take on a one type of human or one category of human. Do you know what I mean? So just as a side note, we should really be aware of it. And in all tantric literature and all tantric Gana chakras and everything, this is not about gender, it's about sexuality, in my opinion. So whether it's monastic or lay tantric practices, they're all actually talking about sexuality in these different dichotomies of gender, right? And speaking of literature, Janet also sent something else. I'm going to read this and totally change the
comment on
topic.
this particular topic before
Okay,
you
but
raise
can you-
another question?
But yeah.
Yeah, very brief. Okay, I want to push the boundary even further, and I would be very interested in the instrumental use of terma pushing boundaries in particular. So if we look at Buddhism and proselytization and distribution, dissemination, when does the terma tradition actually arise? After a long period of basically, whatever, non-existent kind of Buddhism or Buddhist practice, apparently. And when does it arise again, for example, in Taiwan? And how is it used, and how is it popularized, and who's involved? And terma seems to be a real fantastic, actually, focus for questioning these boundaries and looking at how it is used in order to transgress these boundaries and transform, obviously, existing social, gender, whatever patterns into something new for maybe its own purpose. That's just a question.
Okay, can I just say something that Janet sent? Again, it's about Padmasambhava, because this is actually a seminar on Padmasambhava. She's asking, it would be interesting to see how Padmasambhava is being received now in contemporary Tibetan literature in communities. Yeah, in contemporary Tibetan communities. And is he the subject of poetry of specifically dedicated literature at all? Maybe that's a question to you to ponder on. And then also she wants to see if it would be possible to compare literary qualities of the classics Katang literature. Yeah, because there's lots, and maybe nobody actually done anything like that. And others, some vividly written or expressive than others, and so forth. And then another question is, to what extent did Padmasambhava lore influence Gesar, or vice versa? Because it's another very important lore in Tibetan culture. Yeah, and very often it's kind of presented as almost as, not as opposite, but as an alternative vision of Tibetan identity in a way, right? So I think these are also very interesting questions to think in conjunction with literature as well as myth making, as Ju was saying. Because these huge two figures are legendary figures, no matter how hard we try to find the human in them, right?
One quick response to Mona's comment is I think it's very interesting to think about how terma does change boundaries, and I think you were speaking in more metaphorical terms about boundaries, but one area that kept coming to mind for me is the Bayul tradition that we haven't discussed, that's so central to the way Padmasambhava, his presence spread throughout the Himalaya. And it reminded me of Jongbu's poem that Lama Jop so generously shared with us, where that poem raises the question of what is lost in this story of Padmasambhava's relationship with the local deities. And it's very anecdotal, I haven't done any research on this, but I recall traveling in Sikkim and speaking with a Limbu gentleman who was very interested in the oral traditions of the Limbu community, where Padmasambhava and the Tibetans were really seen as colonizing forces destroying their own culture. And so Jonggu's poem seems to reflect the Tibetan idea of Padmasambhava as a foreigner coming into Tibet, but then over time he transforms into Tibet itself, that then expands in a very colonizing imperialist way into the southern side of the Himalayas. So that's another area where the relationship between cultural identity and indeed to some extent national identity is very interesting that we can look at perhaps. Yeah, Dave.
So just to go back to the original question that Janet posed, I have kind of several thoughts about it. Is that working?
Yes, just speak to it.
Hello. Hi.
Yes, perfect.
How you doing? Okay. So, and this is based upon the last 7 years of my life where I've done exactly those things Janet is talking about, but not in my scholarship. Namely, I've given a huge part of my life over to thinking about the American domestic context and public elementary schools and entrepreneurship and the training of healthcare professionals and so forth, and considering these issues about how this body of knowledge has any implications or what implications it might have for us thinking today about the possibility of flourishing, not just human flourishing, but a larger collective flourishing across species. And so I have two thoughts about that in relationship to Padmasambhava. And Padmasambhava is just a dude, but he's a dude that represents a lot of different things. So one is the context of contemplation. This is a rage in this country for yoga, for mindfulness, and so forth. And when I look at that rage, and I'm very central to it these days, I'm centrally involved with it. I'm not central to it, but I'm not Alan Wallace, FYI. So,
Yeah.
is the thing that strikes me as so divergent is this notion of the context of contemplation. We've spent 2 days now talking about the rich, complicated context of contemplation. It's intellectual, it's historical, it's aesthetic, it's environmental, it's somatic, it's people's motivations, etc. That all of that, you can't just strip these practices out and look at procedural instructions and say, now we've gotten it. So in that way, we could distill the lessons of this and kind of, sanitize it and wrap it. And in some ways, it would be a message that says, no, you're not doing what they were doing. And there may be fundamental limitations about the project that you're engaged in to embrace, these notions of practices of well-being and mindfulness and yoga and so forth because of that failure to understand. So that's one thing that comes to mind. A second thing I think someone was mentioning just a short while ago, which is these issues of identity practice. What I find is just over and over in all these different contexts, our embrace of consistency, homogeneity, and regulation. And that has not been on display over the last 2 days. It's a value, it's a tension in Tibetan religious culture, but it's one that the poles are very different from what we have in our contemporary culture. And so when we think about these practices that we engage in our learning environments and other contexts, this notion that here's a whole culture that was grounded in a different set of assumptions, that was comfortable with internal heterogeneity, comfortable with a lack of that kind of consistency, and comfortable with a lack of that constant regulatory environment imposed upon yourself. And then the final two things, which are a little bit different context. One is, I kept thinking, which my whole life involved with Tibet, I'm constantly deeply ambivalent about violence and sexuality. And this was all over the last 2 days. So this issue about when you push the connection between religion and violence and religion and sexuality and claim that in a religious context you can have some kind of transformative perspective on this, which is all over Tibetan Buddhism, I think the Padmasambhava and his whole deal just shows the severe limits and problematic nature of those two moves. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. And the final lesson is inspired by reading a book last year that someone wrote who's not a Tibetologist about a 20th century Tertun in Sikkim. Anybody know the name of that guy? And anyways, it was a really fascinating book because it was drawing upon kind of not, the guy's dead, but he talked to his son and people who remembered him and so forth, so it was deeply ethnographic. And the guy disappeared in the mountains up in Sikkim on his way to, reveal the hidden land. And it was like so literal. This was a very major figure in the mid-20th century in the world of Tibetan Buddhism. You know, a Tertun, someone highly respected by many major figures. And he literally was going out there in the glaciers to reveal a Pure Land, and he died and other people died. And so it just also raises these issues of the literalness of religion and religious beliefs. And no matter how deeply symbolic or hermeneutic a tradition might be, which this is, there's still this rock bottom amongst the elite, not just the popular, about the literalness of religious belief. So there too something, I think, lessons for us to learn.
Do you think that's because it's whatever authentic experiences these people had, or the fundamental, profound beliefs they had, which some of us may probably, lack? I don't know.
You mean the last example of the
Yeah.
Tertun who died?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's exactly the issue. And I tried to raise that with Longchenpa as well, where he's got the golden scrolls, he's got the visions and so forth, but I goddamn wrote this book. Okay? So there's just this constant oscillation. It's I wouldn't say it's undecidable because it's constantly decided, but it's decided in different ways by different people in different contexts. So this guy, a great teacher by many standards, charismatic, well-respected, and he thinks there's a hidden land up in the mountains in Sikkim, and he died. Or my own, teacher, one of my own teachers, Khenpo Jigpun, who, when I first went up there, and there he put those rocks and and statues and scrolls in front of me and said, "There's my stuff, and I want you to translate them now." So, and you're like, okay.
Should I answer Janet's question or not?
Yeah, please, yes.
I'll
please.
just be really brief because they're really big questions and complex questions. In terms of contemporary Tibetan literature, Padmasambhava features, in terms of contemporary creative Tibetan literature,
Yes.
Padmasambhava doesn't feature that much. When it features, people kind of appeal to him or evoke him for protecting Tibet. But in terms of course, Padmasambhava literature, and in terms of Gesa epic, Padmasambhava is a constant present. His presence is there throughout Gesa epic, so you would see it everywhere. Either King Gesa himself is guided by Padmasambhava, or sometimes he's seen as a reincarnation of Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava appears, and it's just throughout the epic text you will find Padmasambhava. In terms of the literary kind of aesthetic qualities of the texts on Padmasambhava, as many of you know, many of the biographical literature, many, for instance, like Yeshin Tsorgyal's biography, Wisdom Kando's, Sarah Jacobson's research, Wisdom Kando's Namtar and the biography and her collected work, and the Longchen Ramjumba, and all this Dotipchen Tambi Nyema. If you want the incredibly beautifully written, well-written, beautifully written language. In terms of Terma literature, maybe like Rinzin Goldim's Terma literature on Padmasambhava is some of the most beautiful literary examples, finest kind of poetic examples you will find in Tibetan literature. Like in Pama Guatang, it's also poetic and intimate, and in Gesa, of course, is poetic. So it's full of, from a literary angle, you can, especially if you really want to find some of the most beautiful kind of passages, go and see Rinzin Godim's Terma.
Okay, thanks. We actually have very few minutes left, so yes, there was.
Okay, I just wanted to throw out, the Rubin Museum actually had a living Terton here this summer. You may not have known it, but he is. And at padmasambhava.org is where you can read about him. And I was just sitting there on the front row, and my whole body was filled with light. And I just stopped listening to what he was saying and just marinated for 2 hours. It was wonderful. And he's frequently in New York State. He has a place in New York State. Just tossing that out. And that things are happening right here, right now, that are real. Real in the sense of a human being experiences it. And there are other people here in the city, too. Just tossing that one out.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Janet's comment about other disciplines and other departments. I don't know how many of you all here are from the other. I am the other, and feel very much the other sitting here, because I'm coming from the critical studies department and the cinematic arts, and then now I'm working in leadership. So, but I do think Padmasambhava was fascinating when we are working in management, and the whole idea of the counselor for the king, and the tankas in the second and third floor in the Rubin Museum really work very well in the whole Asian concept of the role of counsel, where the imperial forces are concerned, in Indian and Tibetan traditions. But the idea that the Tibetan kings would eventually deal with the same thing that Indian kings have a few thousand years ago begun to work with counsel, the whole idea of counsel and spiritual counsel and the role of the sage in the court. So for leadership, that's sort of how we were bringing it into management work. So Padmasambhava as counsel in the imperial court. But so my whole curiosity with this seminar had been about methods he might have used for taming. And I was really curious, what would that have been? How do you tame aggression? And of course, I was thinking about a very simple literary comparison with Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Fox, telling the little prince, if you tame me, I'll be your friend. So the whole idea of taming was my whole curiosity, and the methods itself used qualitatively. What is the method of an enlightened counselor for the imperial court, and what are his taming processes? So that was, I think, coming from an entirely different field. And when I would bring up the idea of power coming from the East in management literature, because we would never have, references to Eastern poems on what stewardship was like true power, where you don't try to dominate, but empower, the least amongst you. So I think those sort of were spaces where we're already feeling we're drawing a lot out of the Eastern traditions and trying to bring it into our disciplines too. But I think the very paradigms, and words we use and we would be curious about would be so different from within the Tibetan studies. And I think that's why they're so siloed and bridges are not being built, because the very vocabulary would be so different. And, and I don't know how much of an effort is being made to build those bridges.
So,
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. I think it's a very valid question, and it's very important to think about terminology and how we actually present things. And of course, as philologists and historians, you try to be true as close as possible to the material you have. And also as anthropologists, we try to use the words that people tell us that are important for them and try to understand them in their own context. But of course, us sitting here discussing Padmasambhava is another level, it's another meta level. And he's obviously a fascinating figure who is a great projection. I mean, he's a canvas. He's basically everything. He fits us all in a way with all our interests, and including changes and including transformation. And I won't comment on the subjugation part because that's very tricky. I think it's very violent in many ways. But on the other, if you look at it internally, it's about taming your mind, so your own mind and your own ego. And so, of course, that fits very well with leadership, and really, I mean, in a positive way, what we would want leadership to be.
Well, I know many people have flights and trains to catch, and we're scheduled to end at 12:30. So we can perhaps leave this with the aspiration that these conversations will continue into far more venues than just this room, and that this can be the beginning of many conversations that do, in fact, draw upon Padmasambhava's tradition and traditions around him in the aim of flourishing on this planet, which is not flourishing in as many ways as we might hope at the moment. And to thank, again, everyone who attended and participated, the presenters who traveled from all over the world really to help, and most of all to Elena for organizing the exhibition to begin with, and the entire seminar as a whole.
And the funders, the Zhang Jingguo
And the
Foundation.
Zhang Jingguo Foundation.
We should thank the Zhang Jingguo Foundation for supporting the seminar, for making it possible for all of you guys to be here in one way or another. But I also, before you all leave, I've been asked by people in the audience whether there will be proceedings of the seminar. So this is not really up to me to decide. It's really up to you. So if you feel like there might be some worth in writing your thoughts down and then having it in some kind of form available to other people, that would be another thing to think about. Let me know. Thank you.